They found the ledger in a cedar chest, sealed shut with rusted nails. A family record so old that the ink had turned brown and the names had started to fade into the paper like ghosts. 10 generations, all sharing the same last name. All born within a 2-mile stretch of forgotten farmland that doesn't even show up on modern maps anymore. It began like so many American tragedies, with love, or at least something that pretended to be it. The first generation were settlers, carving their existence out of hard soil and silence. Isolated, devout. The kind of people who believed that the world outside their fences was wicked and that salvation meant staying pure. But purity has many meanings. For them, it meant keeping their blood their own. Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The first cousins married each other out of necessity, or so they said. There were no other families nearby and no preacher for miles who would say no. But what started as survival became something else. A quiet pact that turned into a tradition. Children grew up knowing they'd marry someone with their own face, their own eyes, a mirror of themselves. By the third generation, the isolation was complete. They built their own schoolhouse, their own church. They wrote their own rules. And with each birth, the line between family and identity blurred until even they couldn't tell where one ended and another began. Neighbors who passed through, traders, missionaries, census men, spoke of strange eyes watching them from windows. Eyes that didn't blink right, faces that were almost beautiful but somehow wrong, like a painting left too long in the sun. No one stayed long enough to ask questions. Then, sometime around 1913, the births began to decline. The infants that did survive rarely spoke, rarely smiled. Doctors, the few who came, left shaken, muttering words like degeneration and genetic collapse. But within the family, they had another name for it. They called it the thinning. No one outside the valley was supposed to know what that meant, and for nearly a century, no one did, until the last surviving member, a woman with a face eerily familiar to all those fading portraits, was found wandering near the ruins of the homestead, repeating one phrase over and over. We were supposed to be pure. But purity, it turns out, is just another word for decay. The woman's name was Clara, though the birth records called her Clara Tilwyn. That wasn't a title, it was a label. The family had run out of names generations ago. They recycled them, as though time itself looped endlessly inside their valley. The same faces, the same names, the same blood, repeating, collapsing inward like a dying star. When the state finally took her in, Clara was 73 years old, but looked half that. Her features were almost symmetrical, unsettlingly so, the kind of beauty that felt artificial, too precise to be real. But her eyes, they were ancient. Not old, ancient. Doctors noted her unsteady gait, her shallow speech, her uncanny memory for dates no living person should know. She recited the names of her ancestors backward to the 1700s. She remembered the exact date the church bell cracked, the winter the first stillborn child was buried under the apple tree, the year the stream turned black with iron and no one drank again. Investigators thought she was delusional, but when they went to the site, what was left of the settlement, they found the tree, they found the bell, they found the stream, still stained a dark, oily red. Buried beneath the old chapel were the bones of dozens of children, none older than 10, some deformed, some missing their skull plates entirely. The grave markers weren't carved with names, just symbols, spirals, crosses turned sideways. The same mark appeared on the family Bible, scorched into the leather, a circle swallowing its own tail. The medical examiners wrote it off as a product of severe inbreeding, a line in a report that would gather dust in a county archive. But when they tested Clara's DNA, something didn't fit. It wasn't just the expected genetic damage. There were anomalies, proteins that shouldn't have formed, gene sequences that didn't match any known human pattern. One researcher described it quietly years later as evolution folding back on itself. When they asked Clara what she remembered of her family's beliefs, she said this: they thought they were chosen, that the blood would make us closer to God, but God stopped listening after the 7th generation. And then she smiled, a small, strange smile that didn't reach her eyes. They kept going anyway. After Clara's death in 1982, the property was auctioned off to the state. Officially, It was designated as a conservation zone, a polite way of saying buried and forgotten. But that didn't stop the rumors. Hunters who wandered near the old church claimed to hear voices under the ground. Others said the air there hummed, like electricity running through wet soil. A group of anthropology students from a nearby college visited the site in 1997 for a field project. They only stayed one night. Their recordings, the few that survived, are faint, but you can hear one thing clearly: the sound of something moving under the floorboards. The professor dismissed it as rodents, but one student described the sound in her journal differently. She said it was like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. A month later, she withdrew from the program. Her final note to her advisor was only 3 words: the blood remembers. By then, the town nearby, the closest human settlement, had already started to talk. People whispered that anyone who touched the soil got sick, not all at once, but slowly. Their hair would thin, their skin would pale, their children were born with the same distant eyes as the ones in those faded photographs. The state sent inspectors, then stopped sending them. The official explanation was contamination, some mix of agricultural runoff and mineral poisoning. But internally there was a phrase passed between departments that never made it to the report's familial persistence. A phenomenon where a genetic signature somehow resists dilution, refusing to fade even after contact with outside DNA. In simple words, the bloodline didn't die. It spread. If you go to that county today, you won't find the name of the family in any registry. But locals will tell you the people still live there, scattered, quiet, keeping to themselves. They don't marry outsiders. They don't go to hospitals. They bury their dead deep. And sometimes, when the fog rolls over the fields, you can see candlelight in the valley. Long after the land was declared uninhabited, Clara said God stopped listening after the 7th generation. Maybe he did. But something else didn't. Something that learned how to listen through the blood. When the archivist opened the sealed county records in 2008, he thought it would just be another bureaucratic cleanup. The kind of job no one wanted, boxes of forgotten reports and brittle film reels. But by the second box, he called in a colleague. The photographs inside weren't supposed to exist. Black and white portraits, each taken decades apart, yet the faces, the same faces, appeared over and over. A woman with the same eyes as Clara, wearing clothes from the 1800s, then again in a 1920s dress, then a 1950s blouse. Each generation was almost identical, as if the bloodline had trapped itself in a repeating image. Only the background aged, walls crumbling, furniture decaying, smiles fading. The flesh stayed eerily constant. Among the documents was a journal, wrapped in a strip of muslin. It wasn't Clara's. The handwriting belonged to a man named Ezra, born around 1840. He described the family's creed in long, careful strokes. The blood is not ours to spend. It is the vessel. We keep it whole, that it may remember. At first, it reads like religious mania, but near the end the tone changes. He writes of voices not divine but ancestral, whispers that spoke to him at night, telling him who would be born, who would die, who would fail the blood. He claimed he saw their faces in the reflection of the well, all staring back as one. The final page is smeared, the ink warped by water or tears. It says only, "The blood is beginning to think." Modern geneticists reviewed the documents for authenticity. They dismissed them publicly, called them local folklore, but privately one of them kept the files. In an anonymous interview years later, he said he found something in the DNA samples the lab was given, something he couldn't explain, not mutation, not disease, something deliberate. When asked what he meant by that, the scientist said this: "You can tell when evolution is random, chaotic, but this wasn't random, it was organized, like it was trying to correct us." And then, with a long pause, "Sometimes I wonder if it succeeded. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Because for some families, the past doesn't die, it just waits to be remembered." By the time the federal team arrived in 2013, the land had already reclaimed the valley. The church was gone, swallowed by roots and silence. Only the stone foundation remained, slick with moss, marked with that same spiral symbol that appeared in Clara's Bible. The scientists called it an archaeogenetic recovery mission, though no one ever said who funded it. They dug carefully, expecting bones, artifacts, maybe remnants of rural isolation. What they found instead was soil saturated with human proteins. not just from decomposition, but from something living, something that had continued to change long after burial. One of the researchers, a young biologist named Hole, wrote in his field notes that the deeper they dug, the warmer the earth felt. Not metaphorically, physically warm like breath beneath the ground. He measured it 102 degrees Fahrenheit, steady, rhythmic, a pulse. They sent the samples to 3 different labs, and the results didn't match any known profile. Not human, not animal, but something that used human sequences as scaffolding, like language rewritten by an unseen author. It carried fragments of every generation's DNA, layered and folded, compacted into something self-preserving, a living archive. When the team returned 6 months later, Hall was gone. His apartment empty, his laptop wiped. Only a single note taped to his mirror remained. It read, "It remembers what we forget." The project was quietly terminated, files sealed, funding cut, but a single report leaked to a local journalist. One paragraph that survived online for less than an hour before being removed. It mentioned a phenomenon called retrotransmission, genetic memory, passed not just downward to offspring, but outward, to anyone who came into contact with the soil, the water, even the air. If true, the family never died out. They became something else, a whisper that seeps into whoever listens too closely. Locals say that's why the valley stays unmarked on maps. GPS flickers, compasses spin. Hunters walk in and come out days later, claiming they heard someone calling them by name, a voice that sounded like their own. And if you stand there long enough, they say, the silence starts to breathe. Not wind, not weather, just the earth remembering what it used to be. The journalist who found that report, his name was Michael Kearney, tried to publish what he'd uncovered. It should have been a story about lost families and genetic tragedy. Instead, it became his undoing. Within months of his first article draft, his colleagues said he'd changed. He stopped sleeping, stopped showing up at the newsroom. He started visiting the valley, alone. The last footage of him was from a gas station security camera, 20 miles from the site. He looked gaunt, eyes unfocused, whispering to someone who wasn't there. His car was later found at the edge of the old orchard, the one Clara mentioned in her interviews. Inside, investigators found his camera and a notebook. The camera's battery was dead, but the notebook survived, soaked, but legible. The first page reads like an investigation. Coordinates, local interviews, environmental data. But as it goes on, his tone fractures, his notes turn into questions, written over and over. Who remembers first? Where does blood end? How many times can a name repeat before it becomes something else? The last pages are written in a script that doesn't look entirely human. Curved lines, mirrored letters, symbols like those carved into the chapel stones. Linguists couldn't translate it. DNA tests on the paper fibers showed human cells, skin cells pressed directly into the ink. It wasn't written on the notebook. It was written with him. When they opened his camera files, there was one final recording. No face, just darkness and breathing. A voice whispers, "They never died. They're in all of us now." And then silence. The police called it a breakdown. The footage was archived. But people who live near that valley still talk about him, about how they see a man walking the fields at dusk, muttering names that sound like echoes of their own. They say his eyes shine when the light hits them, bright, symmetrical, familiar. Maybe he became what the blood was always trying to make, not a man, not a god, but a memory given shape. Maybe that's what 10 generations of cousins made, not a lineage, but a mirror, something that stares back. And if you listen closely, if you let the quiet linger just long enough, you might hear it too. That faint hum under your skin, the sound of the blood remembering you. If you stand at the valley's edge now, you wouldn't think anything ever happened there. The hills roll quietly, the grass moves with the wind, and the ruins of the old church lie buried beneath layers of moss and time. Nothing grows right though. Trees twist back toward the soil. Birds won't land. Even the air feels heavier, thick, almost watchful. Locals say it's just superstition, that the ground is cursed, but people still go missing there, quietly. They send search parties every few years. It always ends the same way. They find the camp, the vehicles, but the trail stops abruptly, as if whoever walked it simply vanished mid-step. Dogs refuse to track. Radios crackle with static that sometimes sounds too much like voices. The same word repeats, soft and distant, carried on the wind pure. The state has fenced off the valley now. No trespassing, no exploration. But the fence isn't to keep people out. It's to keep something in. When you study enough of America's forgotten families, you start to see patterns. The places where isolation met faith, where devotion turned inward until it broke. But the story of this bloodline, it isn't about madness or mutation. It's about what happens when people try to perfect themselves, when they refuse to let go of who they were, until the very act of remembering becomes its own disease. The bloodline wasn't cursed. It was obeyed. Maybe that's why the DNA samples never decayed, why the soil still pulses beneath the chapel ruins. The experiment never ended. The family simply changed form, their names erased, their graves unmarked, their story buried beneath history's polite silence. Yet the pattern persists. You can dismiss it as myth if you want, but history is full of myths that turned out to be warnings. So if you ever find yourself driving through that part of the country where the road signs vanish and the sky feels too close, remember this story. Don't stop if you see a light in the fog. Don't answer if you hear your own name whispered back at you. Because some legacies don't stay buried, they remember, they wait. And when you listen too long, they listen back.